And then I got to a point where a couple years later, after I'd released the overdrive pedal, I got approached by a friend of mine named Jeff Hyatt, who I toured with in the 90s in a band called the Lemons. And he wanted me to build an amp, a tube amp. And I was like, well, I don't know anything about tubes. I'd kind of learned a little bit from my friend Jesse, who was a tech for Fugazi, and he had helped me build an amp or two. And so I went and found Robert Mugner. He used to work at this place called Vetco in Bellevue, which is outside of Seattle. And I just remember every time I go in the store to talk to this guy about electronics, he was extremely rude. He knew everything, it seemed like. And I just was like, man, that's the guy I need to teach me, someone that'll keep me in line. And so I told him that I wanted to learn how to build tube amps. And he goes, well, what do you know? And I said, well, I don't know anything. And he's like, well, that's right. And then he told me to come back next week with a notebook and $20 and he would start teaching me. So that turned into years and years of me getting worked over by Bob. And he had a company called Autisar, and he used to work for Alltech Lansing. He was trained in the military in the 50s and was part of the team that actually figured out tubes needed 36 hours to burn in properly. And he worked for Lucasfilms and Universal, and he was just this guy that was a really hi-fi guy. So me and him would just argue nonstop because I wanted to build stuff with distortion and he was all opposed to that. But in that process, what happened is I took approach to building stuff in a little bit different way. You know, most people I talk to nowadays are all about, oh, you got to get those old carbon comp resistors, you got to get this, you got to get that. And they're essentially trying to duplicate what Leo Fender did or what some of the old amp builders did. And a lot of those, you know, those old Fender amps were built for students. They weren't built with the high quality parts. They weren't built with, you know, anything that costs that much because they were trying to keep them in a budget. And when I set out to build Greedtone, one of the things I wanted to do was not worry about a budget. So that's what everything was doing. And I wanted to just build stuff that I was excited about, that I thought would be amazing, and not really care about what it costs. And just, you know, at the end, add up the time and the labor and the parts, and that's what it costs. And I also wanted to do stuff from a standpoint of, I didn't want it to be complicated. I want simple circuits that just have the best signal path and low noise. Like I get tired of stomping on something and hear this hiss. You know, I grew up in analog tape machines, so hiss was my enemy. I didn't like it. So with Bob, I kind of started taking the approach of hi-fi into my world. And so I immediately, you know, I wouldn't use ceramic disc caps, which are very popular in old amps. And I started using silver mica caps. They were, you know, 10 times, 20 times more expensive, but they just sounded better and the highs were way better. And I started using silver wire with Teflon jackets and just all this stuff that really made a difference. And when most pedal builders would open my pedals and look at them, they would just tell me it was overkill. And I would say, well, Greedtone, anything less is everything else. How could that be overkill? And that was our motto for years, was Greedtone, anything less is everything else. And now we've kind of moved the shift to loudest pedals, because most pedals put out, you know, a volt or under, and then when the guys that get really loud pedals, they put 2 volts out. All my Greedtone pedals put 2.5 plus volts out, even down to, I've seen some of my overdrives put out 5 volts. So that is like, you know, 5 times what an average pedal would put out. If you get down to a fuzz pedals, a lot of those are like a 0.5 volt. And just to kind of put it in perspective, your guitar puts out about 1/4 volt. And so that's amplifying it by quite a bit.